Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. There are way more people here than I was anticipating, but that's great. Um, so my name is Alyssa Parrish. I am the HMIS Program Manager with the Institute for Community Alliances, or ICA. And we have been tasked or asked to talk through coordinated entry and dynamic prioritization. I think I said just a couple minutes ago, this is not technically our presentation. I had asked HUD TA, ICF, who works very closely with the Anchorage and Bounds Estate COCs on their coordinated entry process, if they would let me borrow their presentation. And they were gracious enough to let me do so. And so we are going to be going through, their initial presentation was like 80 slides long, and so I filtered it down to what we could hopefully get done in the next hour and 15 minutes. And I have Kim Seitz with me up here and Holly Blood, and they are both with ICA as well. So learning objectives today, we're just gonna go over coordinated entry in a very brief manner. And then we're really gonna focus on dynamic prioritization and this concept of dynamic prioritization and the different pieces that go into it. So we are going to do a very quick elevator speech of what coordinated entry is. Can you raise your hand if you've heard that term before? Yes, okay, wonderful. We're gonna go over the components and requirements and then HUD's definition of coordinated entry. So a coordinated entry system is the COC's approach to organizing and providing services to those experiencing a housing crisis within a very specific geographic region. There are many different models of coordinated entry depending on your COC and what will work best for your COC, and that may change over time. And all models of CE must meet the baseline requirements, as laid out by our lovely friends at HUD. So we have our coordinated entry background. Wanted to go through this timeline because as coordinated entry will change in your community, no doubt, you can talk to Monica right there about the changes of the coordinated entry over time. Like HUD's guidance about coordinated entry has changed over time. So the timeline starts back in 2008 with the Homelessness Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Program Demonstration, or HPRP. Was anybody involved with homelessness services when HPRP was a thing? Anybody? I was. Okay. So HPRP did not require coordinated entry, but it was encouraged in the guidance. And then you had Opening Doors in 2010 that cited CE as a key strategy. There were very basic requirements laid out in the 2012 COC Program Interim Rule, and then the ESG Program Interim Rule also required that ESG recipients and subrecipients participate in the COC CE process. So in that lunch plenary where Karma was talking about the CPD office and the projects that are required to use CE, it's the COC and the ESG funded projects. So the prioritization notice in 2014 provided recommendations for how COCs prioritize specifically permanent supportive housing. And then the guidance was updated in 2016 after the chronic homeless definition was revised. The coordinated entry policy brief was released in February 2015, and it identified qualities of an effective coordinated entry process and defined the role for CE in the broader system of care. And then CPD 1701 was released in 2017, and it gave COCs the compliance deadline that Karma mentioned of January 23rd of this year. So CPD 1701 defined that the purpose of a coordinated entry system is to help communities systematically assess the needs of program participants and effectively match the needs of each household with the most appropriate resources available. And it also encouraged moving from assessing performance at the project or agency level to the system-wide level. We were also moving from a first-come, first-served basis, which most communities were doing because that's what we knew how to do, to prioritizing and serving the most vulnerable, and then providing households that present for assistance a clear path to permanent sustainable housing. And then, of course, after I had whittled down and prepared this PowerPoint, the Coordinated Entry Management and Data Guide was released just a couple weeks ago, which I don't have on that timeline. So the CE process is a way to coordinate and manage the crisis response system resources. It allows communities to make consistent decisions from available information to efficiently and effectively connect people to interventions that will make their homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. How many people have heard that sentence before? Right. And then a CE process will allow communities to reorient the service provision, creating a more client-focused environment, identify which strategies are best for each household based on knowledge of and the access to a full array of available services, improve system efficiency, and foster more collaboration among the different providers. So the shift within the COC to a coordinated entry system really is a cultural shift as much as it is an operational shift. So it's thinking more holistically about the system and the clients the system serves, not just any specific agency within the system. So it's moving from all of these things on the left-hand side to the system functioning in the way that the right-hand side is showing. So ideally, the coordinated entry key elements include that households with the greatest needs and vulnerabilities are prioritized for the limited resources available. The system is easily accessible to those needing its assistance and is well advertised. The assessment process is standardized, trauma-informed, and client-centered. The overall process ensures fair and equal access across the system. Barriers for households to access resources are limited, and the overall system moves towards a housing-first approach. And also, I think another thing that Karma touched on was that while COC and ESG-funded entities are required to use coordinated entry, the system really works best when any project or agency that is providing services to clients at risk of or experiencing homelessness is included in your coordinated entry system. So this is a really convoluted thing that we're going to try and walk through here, but it is intended to reflect a well-functioning coordinated entry system where coordinated entry system serves as the front door to the overall crisis response system. And through that process, many of the households that enter the system are diverted or prevented from entering further into the system, like entering shelter or street outreach. So before they even hit shelter or street outreach, they're being diverted to avoid homelessness altogether. So then this allows the crisis response system to effectively focus on those who are most vulnerable right away. So in this model, the coordinated entry is not just the access point, but is also a process with an intentional flow from initial triage through the various services and housing projects until the household is permanently housed. So this really helps show how the various parts of the system can and should work together to serve households, and it also shows the different ways in which a household can move through the homeless services system successfully. It also shows that the focus is on quickly housing people and that rehousing, that the different projects are not operating in a silo, right? Like this is a coordinated system, and so all of the pieces are working together. And the question isn't, should we accept this household into our program? It's what is best for this household to quickly end their housing crisis. And so just shifting the mindset and changing that question will help focus on the households that have been in the system the longest and have the greatest needs and vulnerabilities so that you can prioritize them for those services. Oh, this was a really long one. COCs will also need to figure out how their system is currently working and find which parts result in cycling between projects or back into the system or not exiting to housing. So then we get to any questions on that, because that was really like part one, right? Because now we're going to focus on dynamic prioritization. Okay. So why do we prioritize? We know that resources are limited and there is not a single community across the country where the resources meet the need. And so we need to be sure that the limited resources we do have are targeted for use in an intentional and effective way. We want to make sure that clients are not set up for failure and that the prioritization process is effective in matching households to resources that will help them move from homelessness to housing as quickly as possible. So coordinated entry is about coordinating the crisis response system and streamlining it to meet household needs in an effective and efficient manner. And when functioning well, coordinated entry should also improve the overall system performance as defined by HUD as well as locally. And of course, it's a HUD requirement. So goals. Prioritization is based on a specific and definable set of criteria that are documented, made publicly available, and are applied consistently across the system. I think those are three key pieces of coordinated entry. Prioritization processes must also be consistent with the COC's written standards, and non-discriminatory prioritization practices must be used. So prioritizing based on severity of need and level of vulnerability is acceptable and recommended in this process, but prioritizing based on specific disabilities is neither acceptable, recommended, nor is it legal. So this process recognizes that the households meant to be served by coordinated entry are constantly evolving and changing, and they're not static. And we're still maintaining that focus on the most vulnerable households in the system at any given point in time. So while focusing on serving the most vulnerable households, dynamic prioritization is nimble enough and flexible enough to meet the needs of households presenting for coordinated entry at any given time. So I think if you looked at the left-hand side of this, the common prioritization challenges, people who are already doing coordinated entry are very familiar with that list. So who in this room is already involved in a functional operating coordinated entry system, like right now, today? And who knows that they will be moving in that direction in the coming months? Awesome, okay. So the strategies that we're about to discuss will help address the challenges, and hopefully for those of you who haven't yet implemented coordinated entry, you won't even know these challenges on the left because you've already moved forward. Because you get to learn from what's already happened. So prioritization explicitly acknowledges that there is an inadequate supply of resources because none of us live in a community where the resources meet the need. And so historically, crisis response systems have typically prioritized based on first come, first serve. And luck and persistence and adherence to program rules and really strong advocates or perceived readiness for housing. So this didn't result with assisting those who have the highest needs, and it also sometimes resulted in unused capacity because beds and programs were being held for people who qualified for them. So static prioritization typically uses an assessment score or set of information, often collected once, and uses that information to place households onto either intervention-specific waiting lists or a community queue. So the order in which a household is selected for a vacancy after they have been assessed and prioritized is static, and it typically doesn't change. Static prioritization does not consider what resources are currently available or soon to be available. It assigns households to a specific intervention type based on the assessment score. This can create long waiting lists for each intervention type that results in households waiting for really long periods of time. And it also creates long waiting lists filled with households who are difficult or impossible to locate once they come up or become available on the queue. Is that big enough for you to see? Yes? So a major challenge of the prioritization process occurs when assessment leads directly to being put on the list, and the list remains static even though household situations change, which we know they always do. it often results in irrelevant information being used for prioritizations and households being on the list for so long that it's difficult to find them once they come up on the list and get to the referral stage. So as an example, this is a sample distribution of a hypothetical prioritization assessment tool with a score from 1 to 18, showing a typical bell curve, which we have done bell curves for VI SPDAT scores across different communities in the state, and this is a typical picture of what those look like. And so most households are falling somewhere in the middle, and coordinated entry is defined by most communities is meant to serve the most vulnerable in the community based on the prioritization process. So in that sentence, in and of itself, you would start at the 18 and go backwards when you're housing families or households. So in this example, the households are prioritized within buckets or groups based on what their assessment score said about which intervention would be best for them. So higher scores within each bucket are being prioritized for the given intervention first, but because we are in communities where there are not enough resources to meet the need, that means that the households with a lower score, but a high enough score to prioritize them for a specific intervention, are being prioritized above households with a higher overall score, but not high enough to prioritize them for that specific intervention. So this approach often overlooks the strengths and supports of a particular household that could be a solution for them or help them to be successful in a different intervention than what their assessment score says. And the curve is not static. So new households are being added to coordinated entry every single day, and this results in the households being stuck in their given bucket based on their given assessment score. So as an example, a household that scores 12 on here is not considered for rapid rehousing, but they may have little chance of receiving PSH because every month there are more households being added to the list that are scoring in the 14 to 18 range. So while a household that has a score of 12 has a higher score, which would indicate a higher level of vulnerability than a household scoring an 8 or a 9, the household with the 8 or a 9 is getting housed quicker because they're prioritized first for the housing bucket intervention that they are in. So the household with the score of 12 disappears, maybe self-resolves, or waits on the list until their score becomes a 14 to 18 because they're more vulnerable. So dynamic prioritization takes into account that there is not one and only one intervention that could be successful for the given household. It considers what might be preferable first, but it doesn't exclude providing other assistance that is available, more readily available, to those who have high needs and are highly vulnerable. It takes into account the dynamic changing nature of the households who have been prioritized, as well as the availability of resources in the community. It supports a faster and more efficient process for identifying appropriate openings and referring prioritized households to interventions that are available. Static prioritization collects one set of information at one point of time and then uses that to place households in a very static order to wait for a referral for one type of intervention based on that static score. So to address the problems of static prioritization, we need to ensure that the overall process is dynamic and nimble and flexible and can quickly adjust to the changes in the population as well as the available resources in the community at any given point in time. So the difference is that the households are not bucketed for specific housing intervention types, and the system is able to move to meet the needs of the households who are most vulnerable on the list at any given time. So in a dynamic prioritization process, the scores are used for ordering the relative priority of households, but not for matching to a specific intervention type. So in this example, the resources available for PSH mean that if all the highest need households were successfully referred, we'd reach to somewhere in the 14 to 15 score range, based on that lovely dotted line there. That's not because household scoring in the 14 to 15 range can only be successful in PSH. It just means that their scores are associated with the approximate number of highest needs households in the community that the PSH resources available can serve. So then the score range associated with rapid rehousing is now moved up to around 10. Again, not because households with a score of 9 might not benefit, but because if we are committed to serving our highest need households, and all of our PSH is used for serving households with scores of 14 and 15, this is about how much rapid rehousing we'd have for the next households. So what makes this dynamic is the dotted lines that mark who is considered prioritized for these interventions, and they move around as resources in the community grow or shrink. It also shows that with a limited number of resources, a large number of households won't be connected to rapid rehousing or PSH, and we need to work with other mainstream or other systems to resolve their housing crisis. Oh, I'm not done yet. It also recognizes that the initial score collected at a single point in time is probably not all of the information we need to make a good referral. There's client choice, current circumstances, specifics of the intervention availability. All of that might come into play when making a good referral, and households may move around. So that means that the score alone does not determine what intervention a household might be offered. A household may be referred to PSH who in our previous system was bucketed for rapid rehousing because we know more about their needs and vulnerabilities now, or because their situation has changed. And alternatively, a household may be referred to rapid rehousing because they prefer it or because no PSH is available. So dynamic prioritization doesn't mean that those who are not prioritized for a specific housing intervention should be ignored. These households should be offered some level of support to address their housing crisis, like problem solving, diversion, help with self-resolution, referrals, supports to mainstream resources. And then if circumstances change, the household should be reassessed or new information should be added because they're not static. Dynamic prioritization processes will use a phased assessment approach to identify those who can resolve their crisis at the initial steps of coordinated entry before moving to prioritization, if at all possible. And the system is dynamic enough to keep trying and offering access to such support continuously for those households that are not prioritized or are unlikely to receive a referral to one of our targeted housing interventions. Questions about dynamic prioritization specifically before we get into case conferencing as it relates to dynamic prioritization? Okay, so once you have the prioritized group, you can case conference to discuss what is available, who is ready, and who is highest need and eligible for the availability. When I say ready, I don't mean housing ready, like the old term housing ready was used, because everyone is housing ready. Ready might mean document ready, available, or you can find them. So ensure that the system is focused on maintaining contact with the prioritized group and helping get their documents so that the highest need, difficult to find households are not routinely skipped for those who are easy to find and already have their documentation available. Case conferencing is also helpful for making multiple referrals if you have multiple housing openings, and thinking through the best connection between the households and the interventions available. And case conferencing can be used to maintain attention and accountability for what has already happened with previous referrals. So some key takeaways is that tools and assessments are not necessarily predictive of any given household's success. There's limited evidence that a household's history and characteristics, as reflected in an assessment tool, is predictive of whether that household will be successful this time in this particular intervention. Most evidence suggests that households can be successful in a variety of intervention types. So a community should decide how they want to prioritize the resources they have available. We aren't trying to set clients up or households up to blow out of any given intervention. We're trying to reframe the crisis response system to meet household needs. We're also asking ourselves, what is the highest and best use of homeless targeted housing interventions that you have available to help those with the greatest needs and vulnerabilities? Case conferencing can inform these discussions and decisions, recognizing that a score alone is not enough to match a household to an intervention while remaining focused on the highest needs households. Case conferencing also offers an opportunity for a community to make adjustments to the priorities when there's defined criteria, but that criteria isn't known for all households. And it also offers an opportunity to reconcile HMIS-based information with client self-report, which may be less reliable. So those of you who enter data into HMIS know that the data that you enter is client self-report, but when they say HMIS-based information in this scenario, they mean like shelter stays that you can grab from HMIS versus what the client is telling you. And then rules for how to address the discrepancies are part of the framework for what comes into the case conferencing conversations. Another major challenge of coordinated entry is when the list of those who are prioritized is too long. So when too many households are assessed or prioritized, a lot of the households will receive nothing or wait very long time periods while they're in crisis. So the list quickly becomes out of date. Communities and staff then spend a lot of time looking for households at the top when a referral becomes available and they can't find them. So a solution is to limit or right size the prioritization list to the resource anticipated within a given period. With this, the community knows the anticipated openings for all the interventions within the given time period, and they determine who is highest priority in a way that sizes the prioritization list to roughly match the anticipated openings. So in a dynamic process, there is a clear policy that households meeting the prioritization criteria become a part of the overall prioritized pool. This pool is then right-sized to ensure that the number of prioritized households roughly matches the availability of openings in a given time frame. And as openings arise, households are referred from the pool to housing program vacancies using a dynamic process. Dynamic prioritization can also be used to inform efforts to right-size the need for intervention types. So it can help answer questions accurately, such as how much more rapid rehousing is needing, what types of PSH are in shortest supply. I know that we ask those questions of ourselves a lot. How much diversion is needed? How much prevention? Static prioritization may seem to indicate what we need for those, but it's likely to overestimate the lack of certain resources based on assigned scores to a household at a point in time, and then underestimate other resources. So I think all of this is to say that dynamic prioritization, if you already started a coordinated entry process, probably can't start tomorrow, because if we did that, we might be setting households up for failure, and they would be blowing out of the interventions that we're offering. Because without intentional planning and discussions, we don't have a system that can support this type of model. So this is a systems change to right-size the interventions to the households at any given point in time, which takes time to discuss and figure out. So Anchorage people are in the room. I would love to hear what they think about this, because I saw a lot of like, yep, that's happening, this isn't good. And I know I'm not trying to put you guys on the spotlight, but you are the ones within the state who have started this process and have been doing it since the beginning of 2017. So would love to hear the lessons that you've learned, and if you have thought about in your reconfiguration of coordinated entry, anything of this dynamic prioritization process. Hold on.
So one thing I would like to state just before we get started is that Anchorage hasn't actually begun like the revamp process that needs to be a community process. Anything that happens with coordinated entry affects so many different resources and projects, and so we've had some internal discussion, but the reality is that we haven't started like making all of the changes we would like to. With that said, I think a lot of the difficulties that Alyssa pointed out with coordinated entry are roadblocks that we have stumbled across here in Anchorage. And my understanding, really most communities throughout the country. The dynamic prioritization I heard for the first time this summer when ICF came up and presented, and I loved it. I loved everything that they said. I think that it is a really innovative way to work with a lot of the challenges that we do see when we become very tied to the VI SPDAT score or whatever assessment tool you're going to use, especially in relation into which program somebody gets referred, the exact point of coordinated entry becomes underwritten. If you are saying that you're going to prioritize and serve the most vulnerable, but then the most vulnerable aren't qualifying for the services you have available, then you're not making your you're not meeting your goal, you're not meeting that mission. And so for the communities that are starting up, I really encourage you to think about that. Also, having the list being static, something like the VI SPDAT and self-report tools really account for like one moment in time, and often a lot of the information you get is going to be dependent upon the relationship with the client, where the client is in that moment, and so it's not necessarily always a very robust view of like the true lived life experience. And so we end up just assigning this score to somebody, and we never account for the fact that since we assigned that score, 6 months have passed, and maybe somebody's stabilized, or maybe they've fallen into crisis. But when we become very tied to that static score, we can't account for the human experience within it all, which is, again, what we're trying to do.
So I didn't have a community example in here because I don't know enough about the community example that was in here to really be able to speak to it well. I think it was Snohomish County. Is that in Washington? Mm-hmm. Yes. I don't even know where the county is. That's why I didn't present it. So I think there are examples of how communities are using dynamic prioritization for their coordinated entry process online that you can Google or find. One of the things that one of our implementations is doing in Omaha, which is not quite what this is, but it breaks outside of the idea of using a specific score to put a household or bucket a household into a specific housing intervention type, is that they are actually, it's more of like a progressive engagement model where they're trying all families and all households in rapid rehousing first, and then if that doesn't work, then they're referring them on to PSH later. So it's this progressive engagement piece where you're not starting out with the highest resource that you have available in your community, because that's usually the most limited resource you have in your community, but they're starting with the rapid rehousing piece and seeing if that's effective. And then if it's not, then that family's being reassessed and prioritized for more targeted interventions. So that's something else. I don't know if that's dynamic prioritization so much as it is progressive engagement, but it does prevent this idea of bucketing based on a score.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that I think one of the biggest challenges we have with the list is that we don't have enough places to send people to, and people do end up on the list for a long period of time, and they don't understand. When we hear clients all the time saying, well, where am I on the list? What number am I? When am I going to get housed? And it's not like we're moving 50 off a week or 5 off a week some weeks. We're trying, but there's just a real lack of resources, and I don't know that that's being effectively communicated to the client when they're going through the process. And I think it's so important that we're not continually dashing people's hopes, but we have to give them a realistic picture of what's available and what's happening. We need more options for people, and I think that the rapid rehousing, I love that idea of like, let's get, it's really in a way a lot of what Kathleen has done with partners, which is like, okay, you're here today, you have no place to be tonight, we're gonna house you tonight, we're gonna figure it out. And that needs to be the priority, is getting a roof over everyone's head, and then we'll help them sort it out. But we can't have people lingering on lists for a year. It's crazy to even create a list like that to me.
I just wanted to kind of touch on the case conferencing, which I think is a very important and interesting piece that we've been using here in Anchorage. Mm-hmm. When we're able to get all of the different providers together to kind of chime in on a client, give an update, really talk about how that client is doing within the community, it gives us kind of a place for us to make those decisions as a group and as a whole. I think it collaborates a lot with our community coming together and making these decisions. Is like, who's eligible for this? And this is the number, but what has this client been going through? Like, what is the reality of their actual situation? So that there's not that static number and a name. We're actually putting a story to the person who's experiencing homelessness. So I think that model and that part of coordinated entry has fostered a lot of really great work and helping people who maybe they wouldn't be thought of as to be the highest person on the list, but maybe they are more vulnerable than what they're presenting. So.
Right, that's great. And I think one of the pieces that I've learned even just like this week, or has been emphasized to me more this week, is there's really two different types of case conferencing or meeting about the system versus meeting about the clients. And so like you're talking about case conferencing and discussing the clients. And I think another piece of continuous quality improvement or evaluation of coordinated entry is really looking at case conferencing the system and like, is the way that you're prioritizing households really working for the households that you're serving, right? So.
Excuse us, sorry. So kind of going off topic, but as we are talking about the VI SPDAT and bucketing people into services based off of the VI SPDAT, I'm not sure how many people in the room were on the last COC quarterly call. It was really good. Abby Miller was able to provide some really concrete explanations as to what the HUD means by an evidence-based tool for the purposes of coordinated entry. And the information that was provided back is that we don't need to use something like the VI SPDAT, where it's one already identified tool that is evidence-based, but you can look at the data in your community and what are the patterns of homelessness in your community and create your own way to prioritize, as long as each individual piece that you're prioritizing on is evidence-based, based on like national patterns or also local patterns. And while I understand that in starting coordinated entry up, the ability to create something like that is probably not what all of us have. And so one of the things that I would just encourage communities to think about is not tying, for the purposes of static versus dynamic prioritization, don't tie eligibility to VI SPDAT scores, but also for your own system growth. If you need to start with the VI SPDAT right now to get your system running, like I think that makes sense. But one thing that we are trying to wrap our heads around now is if we move away from the VI SPDAT, all of our programs have that as their, not all of them, but we have programs that have that as their eligibility. And so now how can we identify if somebody's actually eligible for the program if coordinated entry isn't gathering it? And so if you tie your assessment and your eligibility to the same thing, then it makes it very difficult to grow in the future or to change your assessment tool or to tweak how you prioritize based on your community needs.
And the majority of communities across the country started out with the VI SPDAT. I think more and more communities are realizing that that may not be the most informative way to prioritize the households that they're seeing in their community. I was very careful not to call out the VI SPDAT during the presentation, but so I also work in Boise City, Ada County. They do use the VI SPDAT for their coordinated entry process, but they actually don't use it for any level of their prioritization. So they use it to have a score, but they don't use that score in any way, shape, or form in their overall prioritization process. So it's more of an information tool, like looking at the barriers, because that's what the VI SPDAT really does. It looks at barriers, but they don't put weight into the overall score. So it's really used more as information when let's say they're working with a landlord, and if there's like criminal background or health issues, or, we've pulled specific parts of the VI SPDAT and the questions and the answers on those questions to inform decisions, but not inform prioritization of the households. Questions? Other questions? Other thoughts? I really appreciate you talking off the cuff there. Thank you.
I would just have a question if there is a central database in each community that actually lists what resources are available, if that would be useful to coordinate and create that, because that sounded like a really important piece of the dynamic, was knowing what was available.
That's a really good point. So HMIS has that capability to be the resource hub, but for homelessness specific program. I mean, we could build out like a resource thing, I don't know what else to call it, that houses like availability of all types of housing that are used for coordinated entry, even if they aren't dedicated to serving clients experiencing homelessness. So as I'm saying that, I think that's a really good idea, but I'm also cringing a little bit because that's a lot of work that like, falls on us, which is great. Like, I think that we need to build out HMIS and we need to make it useful for the community. If you can give us more time in the day, then we are more than happy to do that right now. So yeah, other communities have different, like, I heard of one in Pittsburgh, I feel like, that is an online app that has that type of thing, like a resource hub. We also tried something so for those of you who don't know me, I am actually based out of Des Moines, Iowa. And before I came to ICA, I was a provider in Des Moines. And so probably back in 2013, 2014, the Iowa Finance Authority, which is the state housing authority there, hosted, it was like Iowa Housing Online or something like that. And it wasn't specific to PSH or rapid rehousing projects. It was specific to low income housing. And so when that launched, we were really, really excited about it. But we realized very quickly that it becomes outdated very quickly because it falls on the responsibility of either the landlords who are feeding the information into the system or some kind of like manager of that overall process to make sure that that information is up to date on like a daily basis, and that just became unsustainable. But it's a really good idea in theory. I think you have to give those landlords that you're working with some kind of incentive to maintain like updated information on a site like that. Anything? Is that it? Okay, thanks guys. I really appreciate it.